thinking about what we've covered thus far, I don't think we have ever had a utility representative on as a guest, other than Colleen, of course. But she likes to remind us that she's not speaking in her capacity as a utility employee. So I don't think we have. And on a Clubhouse we hosted a month or two ago, Bryan, the CEO of Holy Cross Energy, jumped on and had all this really awesome stuff to share about how member-owned co-ops, sort of have this unique incentive, how they're leading on DERs, and it was just fascinating and a topic I think a number of us have never really thought about. And so we got to talking, and Bryan was nice enough to offer to join us here. And so today, Bryan's going to be just generally reviewing, what Holy Cross Energy is, like how they're addressing climate and decarbonization, and then also how they're sort of putting DERs front and center in their plans. So he'll have a short presentation on that. And then, as usual, we're going to, jump right into the discussion and talk about, everything related to the topic. As far as how this works, one, please just stay on mute as much as you can. While Bryan's presenting or during the discussion, if you have a question that comes to mind, stick it in the chat. And if it's, if the timing is right and it's relevant to what we're talking about, I'll try to call on you to actually come up and ask it. Sometimes we also have to ask it for you just based on the circumstance, but I try to get people to actually get the chance to sort of come up and ask their question. And then, likewise, if during the discussion, somebody's asked a question that, you think you have some insight on, do the same thing, please, in the chat, let us know and we'll call on you. So with that, Bryan, do you want to maybe just start off by helping the community understand what Holy Cross Energy is?
Yeah, absolutely, Duncan. Thanks. And so good to be with you, DER Task Force, and so good to see faces to all the different names and voices that I've heard on Clubhouse and other forums, on Energy Twitter and so on. Speaking to you today from Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where Holy Cross Energy is located. We're one of 22 electric cooperatives in the state of Colorado. We're kind of a different breed of cat. And I hope that in the next few minutes, I give you a sense that there are some utilities out there that are actually embracing the energy transition and actively trying to figure out how to continue to be viable and how to continue to operate in a way that allows for all resources, behind the meter, community related, grid connected, all of them to contribute to a low carbon future and one that's sustainable and equitable for all. So yeah, we're here in Glenwood Springs. You can see out the window, it's a sunny day. About a week ago, it was snowing. It's beauty of springtime in Colorado. And like I said, I just appreciate everybody welcoming me here to give a little bit of the utility perspective on what's going on. So I'm going to share a few slides here, and hopefully they're coming up. Hopefully you can see them. Duncan, you see the slides? Okay, good. So as I mentioned, Holy Cross is one of 22 electric cooperatives here in the state of Colorado. There's a little over 840 of us nationwide. Co-ops came out of the New Deal. They were federally funded through the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Rural Utility Service that was created during that time. And we in particular were founded in 1939, specifically to bring power and electric service to areas that the electric utilities of the urban areas, in this case, Public Service Company of Colorado, refused to serve just because there simply wasn't an economy of scale there. So we mean it when we say we were formed by farmers and ranchers getting together and all buying into a co-op. Our initial share price was $5 a share. You came into the meeting and you put your $5 on the table and you said, I want power. And within that group, they elected their first board of directors, which serves as our democratically elected regulator. And we've been governed that way for over 80 years. To our west in Grand Junction, Grand Valley Power Lines, group of farmers and ranchers got together, did the same thing. petitioned the federal government for some loans to build the electric infrastructure, and away we went. Today we serve, and that number is actually outdated, it's over 45,000 members in 3 counties, primarily in western Colorado along the I-70 corridor. We're about 2 hours west of Denver. If you've skied Vail or you visited Aspen in the summer, you've been in Holy Cross territory. If you've bathed in the waters in Glenwood Springs, you're just outside of our territory, but other parts of Glenwood are the same. If you've rafted the Colorado River from Glenwood west, you've gone through our territory. So that gives you a feel for where we're at. We are unique in the sense that we own transmission and we own generation, in addition to being a mainly distribution electric cooperative. That's not usual. Most cooperatives have a parent company, what we call a G&T cooperative. Tri-State is the infamous, the famous one here in our part of the world. We're actually a wholesale customer of Xcel Energy. We're one of the few that sources our power from them. But we have a unique agreement that allows us to also source our own power and buy power on the market and enter into bilateral contracts and partner with our communities. And I think as we see community choice and other trends moving across America, I think more and more of the co-ops are going to start to look and talk like us. So we're a little bit of a postcard of the future. 2020, 44% of our power supply came from clean and renewable resources. That's up from the mid-30s when I started 4 years ago. That doesn't include the additional 3% that comes from our members voluntarily buying into a voluntary green up program to 100% that we call pure, powered by renewable energy. That is a pretty big number. So 44, 47. We have ambition to take that number up to 100 inside of a decade. And that's really the story of the journey that we're on right now. We announced this as a successor to a 70% target, which we put in place in late 2019. This was announced late last year. It's the most aggressive carbon target of any utility in Colorado. It's one of the most aggressive in the country, according to the SEPA carbon tracker. 100% carbon-free power supply by 2030, and then carbon neutral or better across the enterprise. So that's trucks, fuels, lights, self-consumption, the whole thing. That is, beyond what the Biden administration is asking for. We want to do this in a way which doesn't sacrifice affordability, safety, or reliability for the sake of sustainability. We want to do it all, right? But we have to honor the time-honored commitment to keep the lights on, to keep the rates low. And we leave it to our engineers and our community partners to be creative enough to figure out how to bring sustainability into it right alongside the other 3 pillars of what we do. It all starts with energy efficiency. As a climate scientist, I'll tell you, you want to first try to make the problem as small as possible before you start to kind of replace it and fix things. So we've got a fairly modest goal of 0.25% per year of energy efficiency improvements. It seems modest on its face relative to other utilities, but our area is a mountainous community where real estate prices are high. We're not growing more than 0.5% per year. So realistically, knocking half of that growth off through energy efficiency is a pretty big accomplishment. We're also incorporating lots of new, clean, dispatchable resources into our power supply mix. I'll talk about those in a moment, but it's wind, it's solar, it's biomass, it's hydro, even some geothermal perhaps in the future. Some of that is grid connected from the Colorado electric system, but a lot of it is local clean energy resources of the kind that we announced yesterday with our nearby Colorado Mountain College and Amoresco, a 4.5 megawatt solar, 15 megawatt hour battery storage development, AC coupled, single point of connection to the system, shaped to meet the Holy Cross energy net demand. It's going to be a fantastic project. And spoiler alert, we got 2 more larger announcements to make here in the next couple of weeks of similar projects that not only provide clean power, but also provide local energy resilience as well. We are big fans of solar. We are the only co-op in the state that continues to offer a rooftop solar rebate up front. We also offer net metering and also for larger systems beyond the 25 kilowatt limit on net metering, we offer some innovative rate designs there that allow for much larger systems to feed in as part of our resource mix. Our summer peak is 150 megawatts. So when we add 2 megawatts of solar onto that summer peak, that's a big amount for us. It's not big for PG&E, it's not big for Florida Power and Light, but it's big for us. And actually last year we doubled that. We hit 4 megawatts, and we had 4 megawatts the year before. So we're really bullish on distributed solar as a part of our resource mix. And all this clean power isn't worth much in terms of climate change if we're not putting it into transportation, we're not putting it into buildings, we're not using it to decarbonize the rest of the economy. Because as folks on this call know, the electric sector is 1/3 on average of the problem when you look at the carbon budget. It's really about how do we electrify vehicles, how do we convert gas to electricity, how do we use all electric housing and buildings to try to move us forward. Heating in our area, we're winter peak. But increasingly, sadly, because of climate change, we'll look at a cooling load in future summers, and also industrial processes. So Isaac, I am all over any Bitcoin miners you want to send our direction, because when we add our wind and our solar resources in 18 months, I'm going to have too much wind in the overnight and too much sun in the midday. And if they want to operate off of that cheap power that we'd have to curtail, I'm all ears. Let's do that. So progress to date, we started with our journey to 100 a little less than 3 years ago, right after I joined. We've got resources under contract, 100 megawatts of wind and 30 megawatts of solar from eastern Colorado that'll move across the Colorado transmission system to our service territory. We announced yesterday, the number is wrong here, it's 4.5 and 15 solar plus storage. We've got a new 5 megawatt solar project that is going to be breaking ground this summer, of all places, on the final approach to Aspen Airport. And you might ask, well, doesn't Aspen say no to everything? Yeah, they fought pretty hard, but at the end of the day, we got a 5-0 vote because we were able to convince them that it was important for communities like Aspen to walk the walk on clean energy. And what better way to demonstrate it than to have solar energy be the thing that all the visitors see right before they come in and land at the airport and take the shuttle to the ski resorts and what have you. So we've added solar, we've added hydro, you've got a couple of new solar plus storage announcements that are coming forward. By the time we get to mid-2024, we're going to be 84% clean, renewable, non-carbon, a little bit of coal and gas left in the mix that we pull from the Colorado grid, but we have plans to try to get rid of that as we go towards 2030. So again, a lot of wind in the overnight, a lot of sun in the midday, Bitcoin, call. The rest of the journey is going to be met with DERs. I kind of liken what we've been able to do with our load shape is we've been able to take big swipes at it with a hatchet with these new grid connected resources. We get big chunks. That wind farm is 30% of our energy supply at one time. We're taking out the carbon and we're bringing in the clean. When we get to the top of our stack and we start to try to manage that high frequency variability in that last 15%, you can't do that with just another 20 or 30 or 50 megawatt solar farm unless you're really committed to curtailment and or if you have a market that you can bid into, which in the Rocky Mountains, we don't. We're not in an RTO yet, although we're trying to change that. So we really have to look to distributed energy resources as that fine scalpel that allows us to manage supply and demand and get us 90, 95, 99, 100% asymptotically. And so we're already moving forward with fostering DERs through providing on-bill financing to reduce the upfront cost of capital that most people see as a barrier to DER adoption. We're looking at actually purchasing our own capacity from our own members from their DERs with the distribution flexibility tariff. So if somebody has a battery that they want to bring, or somebody has a generation resource that they can cite, low head hydro or a solar plus storage, and they can provide it on demand, we pay them a monthly bill credit for the ability to call on that resource to clip our peak and avoid peak demand charges on our wholesale supply agreement. So it's, like I said, buying capacity from our own members, our own owners of the cooperative, rather than from somebody that's outside the area. So we're fostering economic development. In both cases, whether it's solar or battery storage, or even increasingly now EVs, we're partnering with local providers and we're using them as channel partners to do the installation, to do the permitting. They know that they've got a good business that's working through us. we know that we've got a trusted partner that we know is going to do it right. They understand what our needs are for interconnection. They've been through the routine. They know what the paperwork requirements are. We work with them to actually try and streamline those to say, hey, how is it easier for you guys to get the job done so you can do more quicker at a lower cost for our members? So we're looking at DERs as, again, that active part of our resource portfolio. We have a peak time payback program where we pay anywhere from 50 cents to $1 a kilowatt hour for reduced consumption during a called peak time event. So if we're about to hit the monthly peak, that 12 CP that kicks in, that costs us a lot of money, if we can shed some load, some folks decide not to be home or can turn things off, they get paid for it. And we get paid for it. We pass, as a nonprofit, we pass all of those reduced costs onto our consumers in the form of next year's bills or a monthly cost adjustment. New this year, we've got the reverse. As I mentioned, we're going to have times where we have an excess of supply of renewables. So we're actually going to pay our members to soak it all up. Now's the time to charge your vehicle. Now's the time to charge your battery. We've got all this free wind. We've got all this free solar. We'll even pay you to use it. So again, if I'm a Bitcoin miner, crank that bad boy up. Let's get it done, right? Let's run full bore for the next 2 to 3 hours because they're actually paying me in addition to me mining for Bitcoin. That sounds like a great idea. Time of use rates. We've partnered with our local transit authorities to bring on electric buses. There's 4 in the city of Aspen. There's 4 in the Roaring Fork Transit Authority, which serves the valley leading up to Aspen, where I live in Carbondale. The fact that these buses are garaged in the middle of the night happens to coincide with the fact that, again, we've got all this wind coming in the overnight hours out there in the eastern plains of Colorado. So why are we charging them the full retail rate? Why not give them an incentive to electrify their buses by encouraging them to use a time of use rate with no demand charge, by the way, that makes electric buses pencil out like nobody's business? And so give them 6 cent power in the overnight hours, and then 24 cents if they do need to charge on peak, but they're so busy running around, they'll never hit that. So for them, a time of use rate option works extremely well. And we look at other large industrial loads, other things that we can shift, look at that the same way. And then, as I mentioned earlier, for those members that want to contribute to us meeting our goals faster than what we're presently doing, they can sign up for our Purchase Renewable Energy program. All of the proceeds, the extra funds that they pay into that program, all of those proceeds are reinvested into our energy efficiency rebates, into our rooftop solar rebates, into the added cost of doing local projects in an area where the land costs are ridiculous. So that helps feed the beast, so to speak, and it gets reinvested in creating great opportunities for renewable energy and growth in our area. I mentioned electric vehicles. We are really bullish on EVs. In fact, so much so that we started with the ride and drive, and everybody said, yeah, this is great, I really like it, but where am I going to charge the thing, right? Range anxiety, that's all I ever heard in 2019, even 2020. And we said, you know what, let's take that one on. There's going to be cars coming, there's going to be options for consumers. Let's take away this whole thing about, you know, where am I going to charge these vehicles? So we basically give away, with a complete $650 rebate, up to 2 level 2 chargers. We have a partnership with ChargePoint. We get them in bulk. We give them away to any of our members, residential members that come in and say, I'd like to get an EV charger, please. They get it for free. And we allow them to finance the installation costs through our DER service agreement, such that the installer, the local firm, never even sends them the bill. They send us the bill. And we take that and we spread that out interest-free over the next 36 months of electricity bills, which is, by the way, the lifetime of the charger, the warranty of the charger, our service agreement. So for as little as $15, $20, $25 a month, they're able to have this EV charging service. And again, 2 residential, up to 4 for a multifamily or a commercial dwelling. In addition to getting installed chargers at homes and workplaces, we're also supporting our communities by providing an identified priority list of areas where there's a park or a shopping center or a location that people want to drive to, and our system infrastructure is ready to hold the extra load. And we said, look, these are the 50 best spots on our system to deploy a fast charger. You put the fast charger there, we will provide you with all the engineering support free of charge. will pay for the first up to 150K in upgrades to make sure it gets located there in a way that's good for you and good for us. Now you can put it anywhere else you want to, but at that point, it's going to cost a whole lot more. It's probably going to be something that we're going to have to haggle with you about. It's a pain, it's a headache. So let's work together and let's do this in a way that benefits both the consumer and the grid. And you can see one of those here in my hometown of Carbondale, DC charger, again, with charge point. We've got over a dozen of these now, either deployed or in development. We're very proud to say you can drive anywhere in our territory and never be more than 5 or 6 miles away from a charger, whether it's a level 2 or a level 3. And that if you decide not to own a vehicle, as I mentioned earlier, we're working with the transit agencies. And as you see in the lower right here, we're even working with the school districts now, because we want our kiddos to benefit from electric transportation and the clean air and not having to breathe the exhaust. So we're working with the school districts to bring electric school buses. You see the Proterra prototype there. And those are the kinds of things that we're going to be doing in the coming year. And again, no demand charge, oftentimes co-located with on-site solar to make sure that we're charging green as well as discharging green. So it's a great element of our community development. I mentioned behind the meter storage. We're running the same exercise with battery storage now through our partnership with Tesla that we did with EV charging equipment and ChargePoint. This is a snapshot of one of our caretaker homes, which I can see out my window here. You see the 2 battery set, the 2 Powerwall set installed on the side of the home. Through our DER service agreement and the pricing that we've negotiated, basically a consumer can get a Powerwall for $30 a month for 10 years. And that includes the battery, the installation, the warranty, the maintenance. It's just another line on the bill. We front the money, no interest payments, no upfront cost. I would like the resilience option, please. And boom, there you go. It's called our Power Plus Energy Storage Program. The kicker is we provide all those benefits, but we have the ability to call on that battery as a demand response asset. And so you can see on the right here how we were charging off peak and we were discharging on peak as a way to help manage and flatten our load shape, to help use our system more efficiently, to help avoid T&D investments we didn't need to make. We see this as a critical element of grid flexibility, allowing us again to get from 90 to 95 to 100%. The interesting byproduct of this is we put it on our own. This is at our own facility. This is at our own headquarters. And we put it in there. And in the last quarter of 2020, we found that the batteries were helping us avoid 12 interruptions. So those are the blips and the blinks, but 290 SAIDI minutes for that house. That's our own employees that were living in there. And our power quality wasn't that great. So you can see immediately what the benefit is in terms of resilience and reliability of service if we're able to deploy these batteries throughout our system, which was kind of amazing to all of us to figure out. Our goal for the next 2 years is to get 5 megawatts, 15 megawatt hours of battery storage on the system. We'd love to do more. Right now it's access to finance on our end, but we think there are some things coming in the infrastructure bill that may help us with it. Lastly, and I see Tanya on the screen, and she's very familiar with this project. We did a project with the National Renewable Energy Lab, with our local county, Pitkin County, our Basalt School District, one of the towns that we serve, and our local Habitat for Humanity chapter. We worked with them. It was kind of funny. This started as a partnership with my old employers at NREL. We were trying to model our system with a high DER penetration to try to figure out how to plan and do upgrades and so on. And it just so happened that the feeder they selected to study was the same feeder where this Habitat project was going in to provide local affordable housing for our teachers and our service economy workers in an area where the average home price is $750,000 and the teachers make 55 grand a year. So, you do the math, it ain't gonna work. So the school district provided a plot of land behind the high school. The county provided all the improvements. The Habitat for Humanity chapter provided the donated materials and a lot of the labor. The town of Basalt came along and said, we're environmentally motivated and all that. I know you guys have asked for a gas line to be run to the facility, but we're going to say no. You need to do it all electric. And at that point, the partners came to us and we're like, what do? we're kind of screwed, aren't we? And hold on, we've been analyzing this feeder and we think we can do this, and we've actually got good modeling, and solar is great and all of this. So how about we do something fun here and actually do a field deployment that will validate the modeling that we did with NREL on the system. So we could take a model of our grid, we'd actually test it against the real world and see, did we get it right? And can we now extend that model throughout the rest of the Holy Cross grid as we develop our distribution planning for the future? So we were able to work again with partners, local installers, solar PV system, 8 kilowatts on every house, battery storage, this time with Blue Ion, the lithium ion phosphate units that Hank Rogers and team have pioneered for years in Hawaii. Level 2 charging, so some of our charge point chargers. We brought in heat pump water heaters and air source heat pumps, and we put them in the first 4 units that were constructed, 2 of which that you see here, right? Single family homes, duplexes, 2 and 3 bedrooms. They work beautifully, right? The biggest challenge that we had was that the installer for the air source heat pump hadn't ever done it before, and they kind of messed it up on the front end. And once we lifted the sucker off the ground, we were great. If Nate's on, he can totally appreciate that. But it has been a fantastic thing. We were able to donate all of the equipment as our share of the project. That's what got us thinking about this DER service agreement. How could we outfit somebody in the future with this package, and those loan payments basically replace their electric bill in the future? Right now, all the consumers pay is our monthly connect charge of $12 a month. And most times they're running it back with net metering. So it's a really great value proposition for these teachers who are facing high energy burdens and really don't want to spend their disposable income on energy costs. They'd rather spend it on health, food, education for their kiddos. Because it's proximate to the high school, it's also been a great opportunity for the high school students to see sustainability in action. You get a great view of the high school soccer field from the back porch there, and the teachers are able to incorporate this into their curriculum. I also should point out that this area, this Basalt High School, served as the staging grounds for all the evacuees during the summer of 2019, when we had what was called the Lake Christine fire in our area. And we came one burning transmission pole away from putting the entire valley, including all of Aspen, in the dark during the July 4th holiday, which ironically is the most important economic day of the year, notwithstanding that they do skiing and all that. They actually make a lot more money on July 4th with all the visitors coming in and doing recreation. That was actually it was within my first year on the job. And as a native Southern Californian that grew up with wildfires, that actually had a family home damaged by a wildfire started by a distribution line, it's an enormously sensitive spot for me to be in. But as things get drier and warmer here in Colorado, we're going to need to figure out how to provide clean power, but also provide resilient energy solutions. In fact, these 4 homeowners that were fortunate enough to win the lottery to get into these houses, one night we had a blackout in Basalt, and the entire town was out except for these 4. They texted me and they said, I don't know what the hell's going on with your system, but we're doing just fine. Thank you very much. So it was a testament to the value of resilience associated with this project. So that's some of the ways in which we're looking at incorporating DERs into our mix. Again, it's about the journey to 100%. It's about doing it in a way which is reliable and affordable, and increasingly also resilient. We do not see this as a competition. We actually see this as a collaboration. We see this as an incredibly awesome way to leverage the strong community support, the desire for early adoption. The one thing I'll put out there is increasingly we're worried about and beginning to address in a big way the questions of equity and equitable access to distributed resources. The upfront costs, taking that away, does a lot, but so does reaching out into the Spanish-speaking community. So does spending time with those that serve low-income populations and saying, it's not only good enough to just do weatherization or to do bill payment assistance, but let's look at also incorporating DERs so that we solve the root cause of the problem. These are things that are on our agenda. Adam Quinton, who's one of our board members who's on this, is intensely passionate about this stuff. It's on our agenda for the coming year. We want to make this transition not only clean, but equitable and just as well. And I think that's an important design principle. And I'll leave you with this. I think utilities can be an enormous force for community development and for sustainable development. The number of conversations that we have with developers and businesses where we encourage them to come in early and sit down with us and actually, tell us what you want to do and let's figure out how we do it together in a way which is a win-win. If more of my colleagues were able to adopt that, I think some of the concerns that we see around competition and community choice, some of the threats to the enterprise that a lot of utilities are facing would actually, start to subside a little bit. If they were to embrace partnerships with many of you that were on the phone call, they would realize that that's a much easier way to satisfy the customer base than trying to fight and put up firewalls. For at the end of the day, we as a utility, we need to give our customers what they want before they get it from somebody else. Otherwise, we are in the death spiral and our business model is challenged. And at least in the co-op space, I don't think any of us want to make profit versus serving our members. In fact, we can't. We're not for profit. So part of that is I think what makes us a little wired differently as well. So don't give up on all the utilities just yet. They don't all suck. Some of us are actually doing some great things, a lot more, frankly, than you might think, for various reasons of regulatory processes and laws and whatnot. They're doing a bunch of things. They're just doing it behind the scenes. So give grace, give the benefit of the doubt, and God, keep working on it. We need all your help and then some in order to make this clean transition happen. So thanks very much for letting me be with you.
Bryan, that was awesome. I think that was the most sort of coherent and exciting 8 slides we've had to kick off one of these so far. That was very cool. I'd like to start with a question that someone put in the chat that I've been pondering as well. And I'd really like to hear your answer to it so that I don't just sort of come up with my own answer and operate on my own assumption.
And sorry, Duncan,
this was from Tim Haid.
Just going to jump in real quick. I think we can still see someone's screen. So Bryan, I don't know if you want to, yeah.
There you go.
Perfect. So this question was from Tim Haid, who's actually my boss, but unrelated. That just so happened to be the case. He said, Holy Cross has moved with remarkable speed. How much of that is due to being a member-owned co-op? Could you have accomplished as much as you have if you were the CEO of an investor-owned utility?
Tim, Duncan, I'd love to have that chance someday. I do think that there's some agility in the smaller, more nimble organizations. But in a past life, I worked for the Electric Power Research Institute. I was a VP of environment, renewable energy, even fossil generation back then. And I worked with a lot of the big utilities around the country. And honestly, my 20 years, I've not seen any evidence that there's a systemic barrier to them not taking a similar forward-leaning approach. In fact, many of them have been doing so. I think where they get hung up is the regulatory process that we have at Holy Cross, and I would say a municipal utility has it the same with their city councils or their county governments for a CCA. It's a different regulatory process, and it's not as protracted and procedure laden as perhaps some of the Public Utility Commission processes are that take you years to get a new rate or tariff adopted. And I would really point to that as being the biggest barrier to IOUs moving forward. Not to say that there aren't needs for procedures and safeguards, but I think if you stood back and you actually said, what problem is it as a regulator that am I trying to solve? You might find a different way to get to the goal. With Holy Cross, we've got a board of directors that serves as our regulator. The questions that I get from them are no less intense. In fact, they're a lot more intense than I might get from the Colorado PUC. But I also have the opportunity to interact with them a lot more frequently and to bring them into the discussion with other stakeholders and to actually open up our procedures publicly so that people can see them and be involved with them. So, I don't see any reason why an IOU can't do that, particularly if they divide themselves up and take more of a local focus, as I understand that Patty Poppy at PG&E is starting to do, which I think is great. But it would be hard. Like I said, I'd like to have that challenge someday. That'd be fun.
Awesome answer. Thank you. You know, and
I'm
really,
going to ask you that question again in 10 years. I said, I'm going to ask you that question again in 10 years, and you tell me if it's fun.
Okay, you got it, Tim.
Thank you.
You got it.
Duncan, I was going to aggregate a few questions, if that's cool. I think, Bryan, you know, amazing stuff so far. I'd love to see that play out too, as Tim points out, and hope to see you in the seat one day at, you know, doing something like that. But there's been a lot of questions around like load balancing. So I think I'm just going to try and sum up, like we can just attack this one big question with a couple of counterparts, right? So one is around actual imports. So like currently you pointed at 84% renewables for 2024, which is probably the highest mix I think I've seen anywhere. But that's not super dependent on hydro and nuclear. So of that remaining 16% is like if you're procuring from Xcel or some market, so the import of power into your network, is it sort of, is there some like peaking capability there? Is it like a flexible contract? Is it flat?
Yeah.
And then I think, so that's one big question around like the macro thing. And then down to the actual sort of endpoints, like now on the DER side of the market, you have these like very structured time of use rates. Do you foresee down the road having to make it more dynamic? And if so, someone was asking around like the actual endpoint optimization of these devices. You know, is HCE going to be controlling those devices or what? So I think like just the big load balancing question here and trying to attack it on those two fronts.
Yeah, thanks, James. Really good question. So we're, as I mentioned, a really small system, 150 megawatt summer, 250 megawatt peak in the winter. Xcel system is like 7,000. So we're pulling and pushing from the broader regional grid for that last 10 or 15%. That's a useful strategy right now. I'm not convinced that that's going to hold up over time, nor do we want it to. We want to have a number of hedges. We're one of the 4 utilities that's getting a pass-through of the natural gas costs from Xcel from the purchases that they made during the February Texas cold snap. We're more hedged because we have other suppliers and we have our own resources. But you know, frankly, we're still getting hit with an extra bill for power we didn't need to buy, for cold that we didn't suffer here on the other side of the Continental Divide. So we want to be able to be resilient as to where that remaining residual power comes from. In a perfect world, we'd like to have options that generate it locally, but we'd also like to be able to go to a grid. We'd like to be able to go to a market. Right now, it's a bilateral contract with Xcel where they sort of backstop whatever we need, and we buy our capacity, our resource adequacy from them as part of the formula rate filed at FERC. Could we see doing that ourselves someday or with other partners? Maybe, maybe not. Could we self-provide? Maybe, maybe not. These are all options that we want to leave open because the geography of our system is such that a couple of fires in the wrong place and we're making do with what we can generate internally, which isn't everything. To your question about the rates, the time of use rate is a blocky one. It actually used to be a 2-to-1 difference, and we just created 4-to-1 to try to get more people to adopt it. It's opt-in. I can't say that it's highly subscribed, except in those specific use cases where you've got like a transit bus or somebody for which the value proposition is really obvious. I do see us becoming, particularly if there's a wholesale market that we can index to, I can see us passing through some of that and actually voluntarily opting into things like Order 2222 as a way to help monetize DERs and allow for more development than we might get otherwise. We have to figure out how to price distribution congestion and some of the other elements in the Taylor series expansion of the price terms, you know. But this is something I loved doing and digging into at NREL, and I think we can do it here. I will say the Basalt Vista project, we worked with a company called Helia Technologies out of Canada, where they have a set of controllers that sit right alongside the DERs themselves. And in those 4 homes, each one of the 5 DERs were individually dispatchable with control signals sent by us. I don't think that's a cost-effective way to go, to stick a controller on every DER that ever deploys. But I do think there's something to be said for being able to do the real-time optimal power flow of the DERs at the meter or at the panel. And I know there are companies that are investing in that, and that's something that we're actually involved in a kind of an exploratory partnership on. Because I'd love to be able to say to a consumer, okay, here's the load shape that I need you for the next day. You want to deviate from that, here's the price. You want to give me back some of that, here's my buy. You know, here's my bid, here's my ask. And move towards a world where it's, you know, more of a transactive thing, where we're buying and selling from our members as well as buying and selling from the market. What does that mean for our business model? Hell, I don't know. But that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out with our board as we kind of figure out what our next 10 years is going to look like.
That's amazing. So you even kind of, you know, converging those two questions on like the macro balancing and then the grid edge, like you want to structure a pass through that'll kind of connect those two things. That's super cool.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Yeah, Duncan.
Tanya's raising her hand. She might have a question. Do you want to jump on?
I just typed it in. To that point, Brian, you made the cardinal error of putting a slide with data up so that all the nerds on this call could just like pick it apart. I was like, oh boy, you're brave. And there was like this one little nanosecond during the day where you had solar export, and I'm like, what, you amateur? Charge that battery. What are you doing, Brian?
It was a test, Tanya. It was a test.
Oh, I was going to say, though, you were just talking about load shaping, and, you know, it might be good, too, to remind us, I know it was on your first slide, about how much like commercial load versus industrial and residential. I know that PG&E, you talked about this. We'd love to introduce a tariff where we're saying this is the load shape we want you at. Well, PG&E is actually doing that. They're calling it a load limiting tariff, stimulated by folks with a lot of solar backfeed. But it could be anybody who's sophisticated enough to manage their own energy. How does your engineering team approach that with controls? I know right now with interconnection, when you're modeling these type of microgrids or behind the meter controls or whatever it is, they typically will model it as though there is no control or as if that control failed. Right. So what approach are you taking in your engineering culture to overcome that?
Yeah, no, great questions. And to start, we're 50-50 in terms of our sales, residential versus commercial. We have two very large ski resorts, the 4 mountains in Aspen and the 3 mountains in Vail. And we've also got a smaller ski resort here in Glenwood Springs. And in both cases, we're exploring with them just the kind of tariff that you're describing, where it's more of a grid responsive, more of a dynamic tariff opportunity. Particularly for Aspen, they're looking at partnering with us to deploy battery storage in places like their base villages that would provide both resilient operations for their resort hotels and other locations. Vail, we're looking at partnering with them potentially on exploring pump storage using the snowmelt and the snowmaking ponds that they already have at different altitudes on their mountain so that we can get some long duration storage there. And how would we factor that into their tariff? I know that Poudre Valley Rural Electric Association in Fort Collins has an interruptible type tariff for their commercial and industrial members that I just learned about from my buddy Jeff today. And I was like, ooh, that's kind of cool. So yeah, I think these are things that are in our future as we're looking to both retain our customer base, but also kind of meet them at the point of what they're trying to accomplish with cost optimization, resilience, clean energy, etc. I think that's absolutely the case. I think I might have missed a part of the question there. So,
engineering culture.
Yeah.
The relationship with modeling and controls.
Yeah, I will tell you that's something we have a new lead engineer that came over from Alliant Energy, and he came here because he wanted to work on the really cool stuff. So as an employer, you're sort of stoked when you hear that. You're like, yeah, you guys are coming here because you want to work on cool things. Distribution system planning, distribution system modeling, those are the important things that we're working on right now. Trying out different platforms, trying to figure out who's got the tools that we can use to help out. Our interconnection requirements for solar are requiring advanced inverters now. And we're debating and discussing when we might look at grid forming rather than grid following in certain instances where resilience is key. In terms of the managed, the controls, that's one of the reasons why we're trying to encourage people to use our programs so that we know that the DER is being deployed. We know that it's there and we can actually stack the values for the consumer rather than rely on the consumer to go and find a way to stack them when they wake up one morning and go, huh, I wonder if Holy Cross will pay me for my battery support for frequency regulation. You know, we would like to just kind of make that all happen on the front end as part of the value proposition that gets them over the hump to adopt the DER in the first place. So we're really encouraging people to work with us. That makes the planning and the operations and the modeling so much easier when we can see it. That being said, we've got people that are like, no, I don't want you to use my battery. I want to afford it all for myself. And I'm like, fine, and you get a no payment. So it's cool.
We have two great questions from Carl Lennox, one on resilience and one on the electrification. Carl, do you want to jump on up here?
Oh, sure. Never shy. Yeah, so I guess so the first question was really around kind of how you value resilience and think about sort of your willingness to pay for that, and how that kind of gets reflected into rates. And the second one was, I think you mentioned at the very beginning that you were looking at about 0.5% per year load growth, but then you were talking about all the electrification initiatives. So I wanted to sort of understand how that's all playing out and how you're planning for that.
Yeah. So second question first. 0.5% is kind of our organic population number of meter growth rate. We've seen our per meter utilization remain stubbornly flat over the last decade. And frankly, our total sales have been stubbornly flat over the last decade, which, as you know, in the utility math is not a good recipe for flat rates. We've been able to keep our rates flat for the last 3 years since mid-2018 without a rate increase because we've been able to wring out a lot of power supply costs as part of our journey to 100. The point I didn't stress probably nearly enough is that all of the resources that we're adding, those wind and solar resources, they're coming in beating our wholesale energy power cost. And that's with the PPAs, including the effects of the tax credit and all of that. But even the solar plus storage, those are coming in beating our combined energy plus capacity costs. So whatever the equivalent is, we're beating that and we're lowering our total power supply bill, which allows us to invest in grid modernization, in fire protection, in all of the system upgrades that we need to support DERs in a way which is incorporated into our capital budget. And I guess whereas you might see a rate case that from an investor-owned utility that says, here's our CapEx and it's based on this formula for system replacement and lifetime of asset, and so on. And then here's this adder for all this other stuff that you want us to do. We don't make a profit on rate base. So we're not motivated to make the capital spend any bigger than it needs to be. In fact, in a co-op or a muni environment, when you build rate base, you're actually building the depreciation and the interest costs into future rates. So you're building a rate increase in for your consumers. If you're more concerned about competing for their business, you want to keep those rates as low as possible. If you want to be a good community partner and foster economic development, you want to keep those rates as low as possible. So how do we factor resilience into all of that? It's kind of the trade-off, right? How do we do projects which, yes, address failing equipment and rebuild lines, but when we go and do it, let's do the extra 10% or more that also makes it a more resilient piece of our infrastructure. So we don't have to worry about it in the next wildfire or the next winter snow event. So, how do we value resilience? We don't, but we do, right? I value resilience every day when I think about partnerships and projects because I know that if I don't get the resilience thing right, I'm probably out of a job, right? So for me, the value is infinite because I like what I'm doing, right? How does a consumer value the resilience? Well, they look at our Power Plus program and they go, I could have a battery for $30 a month. Is that a price that I'm willing to pay? right? And it's an honest question because that's the lowest price that we can give it to them for right now with where the tech and the labor and all that exists. If it goes lower, we'll do that too. So it's not really I'm going to base it on where you are and locational value and all the kind of crazy procedures that I see in California and New York and elsewhere. It's sort of like a market price, if you will, for resilience. What are you willing to pay? And it's based on your risk. Where do you live? If you live in a canyon with one line in, one line out, you're probably willing to pay for it a little bit more than if you're living in like downtown Aspen, where you're like, it's no big deal. I'll go to the coffee shop or I'll go to my other home. Drives me nuts.
You know, so related to that, something I think all of us have been chatting about in the community Slack recently related to resilience is, you know, we saw in the summer the Western heat wave, right? LA County, it's like 121 degrees. Then obviously we just saw in Texas, you know, freezing temperatures that were pretty unprecedented. If I were running a utility, I feel like I would be experiencing a lot of anxiety about the future conditions my system will be exposed to, because they're probably not going to be reflective of historical data. And that just seems like a really tough thing to think about, though, because it requires some assumption about what's going to happen. Do you have any thoughts there? I realize that's almost an impossible question to answer, but I'd love to hear whatever your thoughts are.
No, it's a great question, Duncan. And did I go on mute now? Hold on. I'm there.
You're good.
It's a fantastic question. And it's one that every utility CEO, every weather sensitive business CEO or leader, or even every resident that lives at the wildland urban interface ought to be asking, because we know tomorrow is not going to be like today. I mentioned at the outset in passing, I'm a climate scientist. I'm also a meteorologist by training. I got my undergraduate degree in weather forecasting. And it was the old adage that, you know, when all else fails, you predict persistence. Yesterday was like today. You predict the climate normal for this time of year. If you're completely confused and you got to make a forecast, just put the normal in there. You'll be around the right answer. And that's not true anymore. You know, if somebody had told me, and yeah, Adam Quinton, forgive me, you hear this all the time, but if somebody had told me when I was offered the job in mid-2017 to come to Holy Cross, they said, you know, it's a great place to work, totally innovative, awesome community, lots of recreational activities. Oh, and by the way, in your first 3 years, you're going to have 2 major wildfires that literally will cut off a third of your system at a time, and you will go through a global pandemic. Do you still want the job? I don't know that I would have said yes. I would have said, you know what? I like my lab here. I can control everything. I got all my switches. It's fully air conditioning. I'm safe from the zombie apocalypse. I'm good, right? It is a tremendously difficult time to try to anticipate what the future will hold. And I come back to resilience and say, this is how you think about not being prepared for a future, but you start preparing for how you're ready for a wide variety of futures. You almost have to take the worst day on the job imaginable and then double it and ask, would I be prepared to deal with that? And if so, what's my plan? And if plan A doesn't work, do I have a plan B? Because as we saw in Texas, not having a plan B put a lot of people in the dark, put a lot of people in the cold, and actually killed some people. And that is the worst thing. Either somebody dying on the job or somebody dying because of the job. That is, you live in fear of that. And yeah, my hair was gray before I started this job, but I'm guessing if you ask my wife, it's grayer now, because this isn't easy, but it's totally necessary. And it's also totally necessary to get right.
Do you think as a culture, and I'm not speaking about Holy Cross Energy, but just the energy industry broadly, you know, folks who run utilities, folks who, you know, work at IPPs, whatever it is, or even all of us here on the DER side, like, do you think culturally we're ready for that, right? Because efficiency and resilience in some ways it's a pendulum, right? Like, and we've sort of like practiced this culture of efficiency for so long. What do you think? Are we going to be able to sort of like change our frame of reference here and go after this problem?
You know, that Duncan, I think you should capture that and make that a clubhouse dialogue one of these days, because I know when we stare at, well, we want to reduce kilowatt hour sales with efficiency, but we also want to increase kilowatt hour sales with electrification. It's like, what? Huh? And then there's good electrification, and there's bad electrification. The bad electrification accentuates the peak and makes you build stuff, and it's layered on top of things that you already didn't want. And it's just, you know, man, are we ready for it? No, but it's going to happen anyway. And I think what we have to do is start moving away in these dialogues and rate cases and stakeholder dialogues from the either or proposition to a trade-off, a way of thinking about trade-offs, right? Yeah, I'm going to have a little less efficiency, but I'm also going to have a lot more flexibility on my grid, and that's actually more valuable to me. Or I'm going to have a lot more resilience, but it's resilience worth paying for, because the consequences of not having the resilience are even more costly and dangerous. That is going to be, I think, how we have to get into a decision space that, frankly, our regulated, litigated proceedings that are an either or proposition most times, they don't allow us the flexibility to do that. Scenario planning, probabilistic risk assessment. You know, we do these things in the nuclear industry, we do these things in aviation, you know, a lot of places where the consequences of failure are really severe. And I'm going to argue that we're kind of here now with the electric power sector. And we need to start developing tools and models and approaches and understanding. And I think that those who do that will win when the climate transition is going forward. I think you'll be the ones that utilities will gravitate to. Yours products will be the ones that will get after. Interoperability, flexibility. These are the things that if I were looking to invest, this is what I would be.
I wanted to just before it's such a, you know, interesting part of this, obviously on the DERS front, resilience. Like, I think Ethan has had his hand up for a long time, so I wanted to call on him. But before we move off resilience, because you actually mentioned it at the end of your presentation, I wanted to tie this into the equity side of things, which is we always come back to a lot. Like, I feel like it's what every conversation I have with Colleen, we end on this point, Sarah and I. But when you're looking at sort of, you know, you made the point of customers can pay for that Powerwall. And I think you're in a really interesting position where you probably don't have to worry about credit risk as much, because like a lot of these costs are socialized. So for, you know, in the private development world, like the first thing a developer is going to look at is probably the credit risk if they're going to finance, you know, a behind the meter battery for a LMI building versus like a Class A commercial building. It's a lot easier to go finance the Class A building than the LMI building, right? But in your position of being able to kind of socialize a lot of these things across the rate class, how do you think of, you know, maybe those LMI customers, they don't want to pay the $30 a month, but it is super critical for them to have resilience and that sort of trade-off between resilience and equity. And then after that, I want to, you know, we'll kick it over to Ethan, but I just thought we had to end the resilience discussion on that maybe.
No, that's spot on. And I think at that point, you've got to start asking, is there a community interest in resilience that's larger than just the LMI customer themselves? You know, the LMI customer more often than not depends on the community for a number of vital services. And so maybe it's not providing resilience to the customer per se, but providing a resilient location that customer can go if they're interrupted. You know, we're starting to utter the dreaded 4-letter word of PSPS out here because Colorado is really crispy, and we may not have an option despite all the work that we're doing to harden our system and change out fuses and do switching and all of that. So can we at least make sure that we have a place for people to go if we tell them that we're not going to be able to provide service to the place where they're at? Right. So I would come at that equity problem a little bit different, just thinking off the top of my head, and say, can we work with the communities? Can we work with community organizations that support that community? Can we do the same for, you know, our working poor, our Spanish language speakers, of which we have quite a few? Can we make sure that we're providing them with the same equity of access and equity of value that we're providing to? Yeah, I mean, there's this misnomer that the LeBron Jameses and the Michael Eisners of the world that are members of Holy Cross, they're the ones that are first in line to get everything. complete bunk. Like they're hardly even ever here. They're off like being LeBron James, right? And so they're not the ones that we like target with our marketing campaign. It's the folks that are actually here all the time, that are in the service economy, that are the workers. And they're the ones that frankly we need to worry the most about, because they're the most likely to be affected.
But so it's more in your position, that question of like, if we're raising rates to fund resilience, we're still like, it's that kind of trade-off of like negatively inhibiting the community. They have to pay more, but you're also getting them resilience. So how do you do that in the most efficient way, in a way, is how you're approaching
that. That's really it. And in some cases, that's a community-based investment. In some cases, that's an investment on the grid that's socialized, that everybody pays for. In some cases, it's a community or a group of individuals coming to us and saying, we're willing to pay more for resilience. Can you work with us to help optimize that? The conversation's not a linear one-size-fit-all thing. And I think it's like when somebody says, I want more reliability. Okay, yeah, great. How are we going to do that? I think it's sort of the same thing.
Very cool. I'm sorry, I'll shut up now. And Ethan, if you want to jump up and ask your question.
Sure. Thanks, James. So, so I really appreciate where this conversation gets to take us, as talking about going deep and going broad, and really trying to not just like do some showcase projects that can sit in their little bubble. But as an M&V geek, I always want to come at things with like, okay, well, how do we understand the value of all of these different pieces and figure out how we make decisions? And I heard you describe a couple different models that are, for me, a little bit easier but to understand, but harder to see how they scale, right? So on the one hand, there's the model of the utility encapsulates costs and benefits and offers some market, deals. Here's $30 a month, and we'll figure out how to balance off the wholesale savings and the capital costs and all that stuff. And you don't have to worry about balancing it out. As long as the customer's happy with what they got and you keep your rates low, you want. So that's like the typical sort of business model of it, right? That you're a co-op. And then there's all the way on the other end that you were just describing a minute ago, where it's like full market, like every customer for themselves, the rates are just going to vary every millisecond, and like just do what you do, and the invisible hand is going to solve everything. I'm kind of skeptical of that latter one. And I feel like there's this huge middle ground, right, where we can engage like all these other interesting market players, a lot of whom are like here on this call today, to be part of that. But in order to engage the market, somehow you've got to be able to detach the value for individual components and figure out how to add in all of the infrastructure and capacity and resilience and everything else that doesn't fit in a customer value side of things. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, as someone who is in a position to be able to make that market, how you would be able to express those prices in such a way that you think it could stimulate this kind of a dynamic market action.
Wow, great question, Ethan. My first instinct is that there may be 5% of our population that would care about all of those discrete value propositions and want to know what they are. The other 95% would kind of be like, why are you bothering me with this? I just want the lights on and I want the rates low. I think that our future, and this is an active conversation, as Adam Quinton, my board member on this, knows, our finance committee is working through a multi-month process of re-envisioning our business model. And we're looking at scenarios for how we think our future is going to play out. And most of them are built around DERs, future, past, large, small, all the time, none of the time, right? But we're also looking at what kinds of consumers we're likely to be serving, and the different personas that they take on, the set it and forget it versus the one that wants to be in the dynamic market versus the one that is more community minded and wants to be completely resilient and self-contained. And we're kind of walking through those and asking, what are each of those types of consumers going to want from us? And all of them, when we talk to those consumers, and we have prototypes of them that exist today, all of them want simplicity. They want what I call kind of that one-click Amazon type experience with us. They want to come to the website, and if they want to order a battery, they want to know that they have as an option to come to us to order a battery and have it delivered and installed, and maybe they get 2 tickets to the Rockies game while they're away, so it can all be done in the day, and they come home and they suddenly have resilient power. And the only thing that's different about their electricity bill the next month is that there's a fee for that. There are other consumers that want to dig in and know everything and maybe even partner with a third-party provider and bypass the utility altogether, right? They're still using our grid. So what's the fair and equitable cost to assess for that, right? So I don't claim to have all of that sorted out or even begin to know how to value those. I'm reading the academic literature. I'm talking to people in labs and universities. I've been asking this question for years. I would really love anybody and everybody who's got ideas to bring them forward. I think our success is going to be in providing our consumers with options and choice. In fact, our marketing campaign is your cooperative, your community, your choice. You choose how to interact with us. You want to be by the kilowatt hour? Great. You want to be a subscription service? Great. You want to generate your own? Great. You want to do it in your community? Fine, we've got that too. You want to get it from the grid and play the market? Be my guest. I think we're going to have a diversity of business models and not just one business model, because our consumers are going to increasingly want different things from us. And anything that you can do to help us figure out how to make that optimal, as low as possible, but still give us the revenue we need to keep the lights on, I'm all ears.
Very cool. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here on some local Colorado stuff, and of course, feel free to decline any questions that might not be something you want to answer. But we had two things come up that I thought were really related. One was about CCAs, and someone pointed out that CCAs in California have been sort of a great option to move things along faster where they might not be otherwise. And wondered if there's a future for CCAs in Colorado. That might not apply to Holy Cross's territory, but other sort of IOU territories. And another question was just, there were some specifics in here, but I might just open it. Any thoughts broadly about Boulder and the attempt to make a municipal utility, and what you think might be an interesting lesson there, or anything else?
Yeah, let me bundle that together, because I think whether it's municipalization or community choice, it arises from the same frustration that a community or a constituency within that community is either paying too much or they're not moving on the clean energy transition fast enough for their liking. If you look at where CCAs came from, and I'm a native Californian, I'm actually a member of, I'm a customer of Peninsula Clean Energy in San Mateo. I have a place out there from my days at EPRI that we've rented. So I'm involved in, watching the board meetings and all of that. And I learn a lot from what's going on out there. And yes, there is a CCA bill currently pending before the Colorado legislature. It would be about a 5-year process of bringing it all together, but it is a real and present option that is being considered here in Colorado. Municipalization in the case of Boulder, and also folks may not know, but Pueblo considered the same thing in their efforts to get away from Black Hills. In Boulder, it was about clean energy, and Boulder and Xcel were able to come to some agreement to, when Xcel announced its clean energy plans, Boulder was like, okay, so you heard us, we'll give you 5 years. And if you're not making progress on this, we reserve the right to go back to doing what we were going to do and become our own utility again. The same forces that are pushing municipalization in Boulder, by the way, are the ones that are behind the CCA bill. CCA is kind of muni light in the sense that you get all the fun, the power supply and the behind the meter programs, and you don't have to eat any of the veggies. You don't have to take advantage, you don't have to maintain the poles and the wires, right? You don't have any of the fire liability. You don't get yelled at when the blackouts happen. It's, to me, I'm like, it's no fair, you're cheating. That's just not cool, right? But I appreciate it as an option, and to the extent that it provides communities and customers with choices, that is within their right to seek. Our view, and one that I brought to the table when I came here, is if it's about low rates, we're going to beat them. We're in the top 1/3. We're the lowest among cooperatives in the state of Colorado. The only reason we're not lowest in Colorado is because we're small and we don't have the economy of scale that an Xcel Energy or a Fort Morgan Municipal does, right? If it's about clean energy, fine, we're going to beat them. We're going to be the first with the cheese. We're going to set the first goal of 70% before anybody else. And then when that becomes passe and OBE, we're going to say, you know what, we've got a plan to go to 85. Now we're going to stretch it to 100. And we're going to lead on the clean energy transition. And we're going to push that into our communities with buildings and transport and so on. The third route to doing, the third reason that a community might do a CCA or municipalize is because the local government might see that as a way to raise revenues and offset the need for tax increases. And honestly, that's not one that I can beat by being a good utility. That's just a political matter. And if a community decides to do that, God bless them. City of Aspen has its own municipal utility. City of Glenwood Springs has its own municipal utility. These things predate me by years and years and years. Every time I go up to the city manager, I'm like, hey, you know, we could work together. They're like, who are you again? So it's the politics that I worry about. And I think that the consumers might not get the best deal in the long run if it's done purely for politics. If it's done for cost or for clean energy, I can see that. But then I think the onus is on the utility to just, again, give the consumer what they want before they get it from somebody else. And I would say the same thing if it were retail competition as well.
Hey, Bryan, I'd love to just, I have to ask you this question and follow up on that. It's something that I always come back to in some of these conversations. And, you know, Duncan and I were just talking about it too, but it's basically just centers on this tension between like franchise rights and the obligation to serve. And I think when it's community led, when it's local, when it's sort of that co-op model, I actually love in a lot of ways because of that community focus. When you look at franchise rights and sort of like an investor owned utility in a large territory that they're very profit driven, it's also sort of their hold on that region in a lot of ways and can act as an inhibitor for maybe, you know, luckily in New York, we have Con Ed, you know, shout out to Colleen, that like allowed projects like the NYU microgrid or the Hudson Yards microgrid, where they're actually building like their own infrastructure, which is technically in violation of franchise rights, but they're like letting it happen because they understand that it's great and for a lot of reasons. And you see in the PSPS case, people starting to like run extension cords over to their neighbor, which we always laugh and we're like, that's private wires. You can't do that because one has a generator or Powerwall and the other does not. So I think there's not like a great directed question here, but it's really just like, how do you think about, you know, maybe even your own geographic territory, if you do start having to utter that that gross word of PSPS, like if some swath, say in the canyon, I don't know the geography well, but they wanted to kind of go build their own microgrid. Maybe it was like more of a private investment. They wanted their own infrastructure shared between homes, but you couldn't make that pencil for bringing that into the co-op. Like, how do you look at this concept of, which always centers on resilience actually, of franchise rights, obligation to serve, like and maybe this bottom-up building of the grid and people sharing infrastructure, you know, in the co-op model versus maybe the IOU model?
So not to go all philosophical on you, James.
Please do.
What is a net zero building if not a little microgrid? Right? And people are building net zero buildings all the time, and they're not asking our permission. They're not saying, hey, oh, by the way, would you mind if we took your kilowatt hour sales and generated it ourselves? In fact, in the Basalt Vista project, we actually designed the project to test out the possibility that the 4 homes could actually support one another during a loss of grid function. And we tested that. We ran it through because neighbor helping neighbor, that's the co-op way, right? And so I think, you know, we're a company, we're owned and operated for the benefit of our members. We have a franchise right to provide the poles and the wires and the service to the home. We have the obligation to serve. But beyond that, we don't have any right to own their consumption or their production. Whenever we do a development that doesn't fit into one of our standard tariffs, it's a little itty bitty PPA discussion. In fact, the CMC project that we had, the Colorado Mountain College provided the land. They contracted with the developer. The two of them approached us. They bid it into our RFP project. And we negotiated a PPA where we basically said, all right, this doesn't fit one of our usual things, but we love this project. It's got value for it. Here's what we're willing to pay for it. Now, they could have said no and then just managed the supply on that campus and dealt with it. But they saw enough value to get better economics and also make that a community resource that now that that's there, we can start going to nearby folks and saying, how can we enroll you in a community energy program? How can we help you stay on and be resilient? What switches can we put at different portions of our system so that we can island a community in and around that solar farm so that we don't have to take the pain of hearing from them about why the lights are out? So I guess I'm just viciously optimistic that when consumers bring forward resources that they want to do, a conversation can happen where we realize a 1 + 1 = more than 2 value. And I haven't seen an example yet where that hasn't been the case here.
So ultimately, you're saying, like, it's, if you could prove that a net zero building is one thing, right? But what if there's enough like land mass on that property that you could make a net zero block? Now
Right.
You're talking about like publicly shared infrastructure. That's where
Right.
franchise rights become a question. Like if some community were to bring you that concept, you guys would kind of deal with it on a case by case basis, much in the same way as say a Con Ed has.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we're actively engaged in a project with Pitkin County, Aspen Airport, the Aspen Business Park, which is across the highway, our Roaring Fork Transit Authority, and our sanitation district, as well as our substation and our major feeder. And the whole concept of this planning grant, which we're going to seek Build Back Better funds to actually go do, is how do we draw a box around this entire set of resources and allow it to function optimally without connection to the rest of the grid?
That's super cool. Yeah.
We might want to do it because it's economic, but we might have to do it because if a fire cuts off the upper Aspen Valley, the only way we're going to get water in and out is by airport. And we need the airport to be functioning, right? So really what I have to do then, James, is get out of the mindset of I make my money by selling kilowatt hours, I make my money by building assets, and replace that with I make my money by providing energy services and by doing it better, faster, cheaper than anybody else. And sometimes that means I do it myself. Sometimes that means I partner with those that can help me. Sometimes that means I do it directly with my consumers in partnership that way. It's a totally different business model. And it's where we're going when people talk about things like death spiral and decoupling and all of that. I guess I just sort of see what the end game is. And I'm just like, okay, let's go there. Let's figure it out.
Very cool. What percentage of utilities do you think like have that mindset? And this isn't like a gotcha question. I'm like actually curious. Like, is it 20? Is it 90? Like, what's your general sense on that? Because I think that's awesome.
I bet you that there are individuals in every utility organization that are thinking this way. How many of them are actually in the C-suite where they can call resources and make things happen? It's not a majority. But keep in mind that we're also talking about a generational transition of leadership, and leadership really matters. We have a lot of folks that are moving up through the ranks, and you can see this at a place like Arizona Public Service, where you have a change in leadership and you have a pivot. Con Ed was a perfect example. When I used to deal with Con Ed back in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was a completely different place. And then leadership came in and said, nope, we're going to go this way. We're going to do this and not that, right? I think you're going to see a leadership change at PG&E with Patty versus her predecessors. Very different mindset. I think you've got a next generation of leadership in the utilities that are even more aggressive, and they're going to be your leaders in 10 years' time. And that pipeline is going to fill. And I would encourage some of you to say, hey, you know what? The things that you're doing today out in the wild, there may be a utility that's like, you know what, we see that as a competitive advantage. We want to do that. So come on board. it's not the evil empire necessarily. You'd be surprised at how much you can change.
No, it's
Well,
great. I really appreciate that perspective.
I think that's an awesome way to wrap this up. Bryan, thanks for joining us. This was so cool. I think everyone really enjoyed it. Thanks for being so open to our probably often off the wall questions. Maybe in a year's time or something, we can do a follow up and hear about how these plans are going. Because I think, at least from my perspective, these are some of the most ambitious things I've heard from a utility, and I'm really excited to see it play out. Yeah. So with that, thanks for joining us, everybody. Be sure to go to the website. We're announcing some new meetups soon that are going to be really exciting. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, Bryan.